I want to go back to our studio in New York City now and bring in a special guest. We have their criminal defense attorney and former sex crimes prosecutor, Vinoo Varghese. Vin, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time this afternoon.
My pleasure.
I want to start by picking your brain about the elements of these crimes. I want you to break down what Harvey Weinstein is faced with here. We know he's faced with 2 counts of what's known as in New York predatory sexual assault. So I want you to educate me, please, as to how that's different from an ordinary sexual assault we might see charged in other cases.
So what they're saying here is that there are crimes that occurred before that lead to him being labeled as a predator. So some of these underlying crimes happened in the 90s, which he technically can't be prosecuted for, but are used to basically bump up the charges and bump up the potential penalties in a case like this. So he has the 2 acts that he's charged with here, but then there's a prior act going back into the 90s, which the judge has ruled on, Judge Burke has ruled on, which are being used to enhance these cases and for which he faces up to 20 years in prison on each.
Vin, am I correct that with predatory sexual assault in New York, the defendant has to have committed a sexual assault against more than one individual?
Yes, yes, absolutely, and that's what he's saying. There's other acts that they're using to enhance the penalties. That's all. That's what it is. It raises this from what's called in New York as a B felony, for which you'd receive 25 potential years in jail, but raises it to a potential life sentence. Though in his case, with no prior convictions, he's looking at 10 to 20, but he could get a consecutive time on that.
Okay. And then let's break this down even further. We know we've got 2 complaining witnesses, we'll call them, the 2 alleged victims here. Complaining witness number 1, who is okay with being named in court, Mimi Halle, former production assistant, and then complaining witness number 2, who is an unidentified woman. So we've got those 2 there. And then we've got Annabella Sciorra, who is not a complaining witness, but I guess, supporting witness. If there's a better way of saying it, Vin, please tell me. But I want to make sure I'm clear on this. If the jury believes only one of those complaining witnesses, either only Mimi Halle or the unidentified woman, it's my understanding they could still find Harvey Weinstein guilty if they also believe Annabella Sciorra. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, and I just want to talk about that for a second and understand that in this case and why this process is going to be very difficult. The question is not whether Harvey Weinstein deserves a fair trial. It's a question of whether he should get a fair trial. That's the question that's there in America right now, right? Does a guy like Harvey Weinstein deserve a fair trial? What's the purpose of all this jury selection? It's going to take a long time, days, if not weeks, to come up with a jury, because already he's guilty in the court of public opinion. And yesterday, with the announcement in L.A. of the indictment there, basically what the L.A. prosecutors are doing is putting a nail in his coffin in New York. His attorney yesterday asked for a cooling off period. That's a reasonable request. Judge Burke denied it. I know Judge Burke personally. I've tried 2 cases in front of him. I've had multiple other matters in front of him. He's a tough judge. And with the allowing of Ms. Sciorra, who everybody knows was on Sopranos and been on television and all this stuff, think about how that is for a defendant, anybody, right? So, everybody says there's Harvey Weinstein. He's a bad dude. He doesn't deserve a fair trial. Well, imagine if it was someone that you cared about. Imagine if it's a loved one. Imagine if it were you. And all of a sudden, something from the 90s is being brought up, and that person from the 90s happens to also be a celebrity who everybody saw in The Sopranos. You can imagine that the odds and the decks are stacked against Harvey Weinstein here. And why does this matter? Because if they can do this to Harvey Weinstein, they can do this to anybody. And the reality is the DA's office in New York, this Manhattan DA's office right behind us, does this routinely. It's just that this is a big profile case.
Was that where you were a prosecuting attorney for a time, Vin?
I was in Brooklyn. I was a prosecutor in Brooklyn for 6 years, right on the other side of the bridge.
Right. So I would imagine as a former sex crimes prosecutor, you were able to use this law.
Most of my state work is here in New York.
Gotcha. Well, we appreciate you joining us there. Would love to talk to you more.
No. These are later iterations.
Okay, you were never able to use this particular law in the cases you prosecuted. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It wasn't there when I was a prosecutor almost 20 years ago.
Gotcha. Well, I'm a former prosecutor, too, and this is a great rule for prosecutors in the state of New York. Vinoo, Varghese, we thank you so much for your time. We need to take a break.